Welcome to the presentation on migrating from the GUI to web with Rapide. The objectives of this presentation are to provide an overview of the common challenges faced when migrating GUI clients to a browser interface, and also to introduce how Rapide can help migrate a Gen GUI client to a browser application. The agenda for the presentation is firstly provide a background information as to the common challenges faced in migrating from a GUI to the web, then look at how Rapide can provide a solution to some of those common challenges, and then we'll finish off with a demo. For the background, for Windows clients, we're talking both about standalone, sometimes called FAT clients, where the database logic and the client logic are all in one procedure step, and also cooperative clients, where the client is providing the user interface and then the database and business logic resides on a separate server. Both are under consideration. The typical issues that most companies face with having a client-server architecture where the clients are distributed onto the Windows machines is really around the areas of software distribution, software prerequisites, upgrades. It becomes costly to do, which may mean you can only have a limited number of updates to the client software per year, and that reduces business flexibility because you cannot update the clients on a very regular or interactive basis because of the cost of doing those updates. And that reduction in business flexibility is often becomes a problem for businesses not being able to rapidly update their applications as they would otherwise prefer. You may also have OCX controls that the vendors are no longer supporting, and that becomes a high cost to find a replacement and recode the application. And at the end of the day, I think we probably all agree that the standard Windows Gen GUI design capability is rather limited and maybe not offering the richer user experience that your customers may be demanding nowadays. So a common question would be, if I have an existing Windows GUI application, can I just regenerate the clients for the web? And we tried that ourselves with our Guardian application, which many of you will be familiar with, and we tried to regenerate it directly for the web using web generation option in Gen, and we encountered a number of issues, and I believe in talking to other customers similar sorts of issues arise when you can't just regenerate the application and expect it to work. Some of the challenges that have been faced, there may be browser implications. For example, OCX controls are only properly supported on Microsoft technologies. Not all of the behaviors and functions of a Windows GUI are supported in a browser environment. Your application, in terms of user experience, was probably designed a few years ago, and the design standards that you used for your Windows application, say 20 years ago, no longer looks right in a browser environment. Also, if you've designed your application to have multiple windows and dialogues, which is perfectly valid in a Windows environment, as a design approach, that does not translate well to the browser. A browser environment is not very good at handling multiple windows, especially modeless windows, because you haven't got the task switching capabilities that the native Windows desktop would provide. Some of the other areas you need to consider are the fact that the client logic is now no longer running on the client machine, it's running in an application server. And so, for example, if you have any external action blocks which might be interfacing to other systems or doing file upload or file download, those are not running on the client machine, they're running on the app server. And you need to bear in mind that the logic is now split between presentation on the browser and the actual code running on the app server. And that also has implication for performance, for event processing, that if you have a very rich GUI with a large number of events, if each event involves a round trip between the browser and the app server, that can significantly slow down the performance of the application. And then a final consideration just to talk about is the actual application server memory. Consider the situation where you have quite a heavy GUI with a large number of views and maybe a large number of nested or chained procedure steps, each of which has a large number of views. Well, that can add up to several megabytes of data, which on an individual user's PC is nothing to worry about. But if you have an application server supporting 1,000 concurrent users, suddenly you've got a problem because you have the memory requirement of 1,000 users in one Java virtual machine, and that becomes an issue and probably makes it unsupportable. So these are some of the challenges that you may face. You probably or hopefully won't face all of them in your projects, but you might face some of them. So let's take a look now at how Rapide has provided solutions to some of these typical challenges. The areas I'm going to cover are firstly the compatibility with Gen GUI, secondly the replacement of OCXs, thirdly we'll have a discussion on performance, then on the user experience, on multiple window designs, and finally we won't have a separate discussion on it, but a key aspect of Rapide is it's been designed to provide you with maximum choice in the browser technologies that you use and also the app server technology. So you're not limited to one or two browsers or one or two app servers. Basically we'll support any modern browser with JavaScript and just about any JEE compliant application server as well. In terms of GUI compatibility, Rapide is designed to provide very high compatibility with what you can do in a Gen Windows GUI. So we support a lot of areas that you might not expect a browser to support. We support very faithfully the GUI runtime behavior. So if you design your GUI to behave in a certain way in terms of the order that events are fired, the use of TIR event, the use of enabling, disabling, all of that works exactly the same way in the browser. We support the wide range of GUI event types. We support just about all the dot notation statements that you might be able to code to code against your GUIs. The Gen function libraries, very high support for those, and we even support the refresh command, which technically is quite a challenge on a browser, because if you imagine a refresh, you have a client logic running on the application server, it changes some views and it wants to update the view that the client sees on the browser. The refresh command will do that in a GUI quite easily because it's running on the GUI. In a browser technology, the application code is running on a separate application server, but we coded the Rapide runtime to support a very dynamic user interface, which would also include the refresh command. In terms of the window design, whilst it's nice to have a single window design to support all the possible user interfaces, there are certain sizes of screens where you probably want a different layout because you're very short on screen space. The obvious example would be if someone uses your application from a phone browser with a very small screen size, you probably want a very different layout to if they're using a tablet or a larger desktop machine. And one of the innovations we introduced in Rapide was the ability to provide different layouts for different form factors. So you can use the same procedure step and views and have multiple user interface designs where you're catering for fundamentally different sizes of screens. For example, large browser versus small browser. Another area that sometimes crops up is if you have a lot of external action blocks on the client side written in C, what happens when you move to a Java-based platform? Well, one of the technologies that we introduced in Rapide is something called the EAB proxy, and that allows you to call C code directly from the generated Java code via a Rapide generated layer called the EAB proxy. So as long as your C code isn't expecting to run on the client device, but is maybe calling some maths libraries or doing some functions like file handling where it would be appropriate for that code to run on the app server, then you can invoke the C code directly without having to rewrite it in Java. In terms of OCXs, well, OCXs are a Microsoft technology that really do not translate well to multiple browsers and different technologies. You're not going to be able to run them easily on a mobile device, or if the customer's using a Mac or some other technology. So really they're not great technology to use in a browser application. And we provide a wide range of widgets native to Rapide for replacing the most common reasons why you may have used an OCX. For example, tab controls, date time pickers, sliders, spinners, progress bars, list boxes, tree views, editable grids, timers, file selection dialogues, all those sorts of things we provide native controls for in Rapide so that you do not need to have a third-party OCX control. If you have a particular requirement, for example, you may need a charting control, or you may want a PDF viewer, things like this, we can also support Java or JavaScript controls, which provide the same flexibility of an OCX control, but the advantage of a Java or JavaScript control is they are much more portable across platforms. They'll run on any browser and also on mobile devices. In terms of performance, this is quite a big subject that I'm just really going to touch on. But firstly, the architecture of Rapide uses a very high performance synchronization between the objects running in the browser, which are controlled by JavaScript, and the app server, and it uses something called JavaScript Object Notation, or JSON, very lightweight messages to synchronize the browser state with the app server, and it only sends changed data. So imagine you've got a page with a lot of data on it, and the user presses a button. We're not sending the whole page back, we're just sending the status that that button's been pressed, or the changed content of a field. So the interaction, the responsiveness of the application as a result of that is very good. You can also use load balancing with a Rapide application. If you need to support thousands of users, you can use load balanced application servers. In terms of the GUI itself, we perform some of the validation using JavaScript on the browser. So for example, if you have an uppercase field, if you've used web generation, you may be familiar with the fact that the user can enter it in lowercase, and it only gets converted to uppercase once the field has round-tripped back to the app server. Well, with a Rapide application, we use some JavaScript on the client, so as the user types in the data, it's automatically in uppercase. They never even see it in lowercase. And then one final area is in the area of memory optimizations, that if you do have these very large clients which have a heavy memory requirement, we have a number of techniques like Java object serialization and the use of shared memory for static data, which can significantly reduce the amount of memory required in the JVM heap to support a very large number of clients. In terms of the user experience, the areas that we'll probably cover mostly in the demo are the ability to have what's called a responsive design, where the application layout responds to the size of the screen, size of the browser or mobile device, and fills that screen and provides a good user experience no matter what device size the user is accessing the application from. We also provide much greater control over whether a dialog or window appears as a pop-up or full screen, and you can actually control that in very detailed control over that as a designer. We have a wider range of user-friendly widgets, for example, date time pickers. So instead of entering a date with DDMMYY, you can select from a calendar, for example. And one of the things you can do with Rapide is you can place images that are contained in a blob view onto the user interface, either as a picture or even as data inside a list box. So if you want to have, for example, the picture of someone in a personnel application, or a picture of a product, or any other type of image, in Gen 8.5 you can set up blob views, and with Rapide you can actually place the content of those blob views onto the window. We have support for multi-language support, internationalization, which we briefly covered yesterday. And you can also theme the application using CSS. So if you want a fancy CSS theme, maybe even changing the theme based on different parts of the application, So if they're in the personnel part, it's in one theme. If they're in the product ordering part of the application, a different theme. That's all possible. One of the big areas that you need to consider when moving from a sophisticated GUI to the web is how do you cater for an application where the user expects to be able to see multiple windows open at the same time. And the concept of multiple modeless windows where the user can activate any dialog that they want by simply clicking on it is not suitable for a browser technology because you don't have the task switching capability, you can't use Control Escape to bring up a list of available windows, and it's very easy for the user to get lost if you try and emulate that in a browser. I will say that we can support that directly in a browser, but it's not ideal, it's not recommended. And instead, we think we've got quite a good solution for that with Rapide frames. And essentially, frames allow you to embed procedure steps windows within frames on another procedure step in a multi-document interface style, and therefore allow the user to have access to all the windows that they need in a tab control or in parts of another window. And we'll take a look at that in the demo. And as part of that, once you start to have multiple windows, you need to think about how you're going to synchronize data between them all. And there's a lot of methods and functions in the Rapide API that enable you to have a very good synchronization so that all the data is kept up to date as the user is manipulating data across multiple windows. So to summarize, the GUI to web transformation, whilst I've focused in this presentation on some of the challenges you might face, I will emphasize that the vast majority of the user interface designs and logic that you already have in your GUI will be reused when you move to a browser interface. So all of the business logic, all of the user interface designs, the procedure steps, the dialog flows, that is all highly reusable. And the amount of work that you have to do to enhance the application to make it more suitable for a browser is relatively trivial compared with the cost and time that you've already put in to building the application in the first place. So we're looking at adding in some capability for responsive design, adding in some capability to handle multiple windows, to replace OCXs, and to enhance those controls. Those are all optional. You could take your existing Gen GUI and generate it with Rapide for the web without any changes, and it would work. But it probably wouldn't be what your users would prefer. So some enhancements are areas that we would normally recommend. And that's an area we can help you with. So we can help you with proof of concepts, in planning and estimating the cost of doing this work, maybe even some custom automation that if you have hundreds of procedure steps that you want to convert and they all conform to a certain pattern, then we can build plugins that will automatically convert your GUI applications to add in those enhancements rather than you having to do that manually. And we can even get involved, as we have with some customers, in project work where we can take on some or all of the work in doing the first cut transformation and take your GUI application and give it back to you as a browser application. So really, we've only just scratched the surface of the capabilities, and I would recommend you take a look at our website where we have an online demo and we have a fair amount of information in more detail about the capabilities. But in the few minutes remaining, what I'd like to do is show you an example of an application that we have previously converted. And that application some of you may be familiar with, and it is actually our Guardian application. So what I'm showing you here is the Guardian Windows GUI, and it's a list of change requests, and I can double click on a change request and I can open it up, and I could have another change request open, and then I might want to produce a report. So you can see here I have a number of windows open, and with the mouse I can flip between them, and that's what we're talking about when we're saying multiple modeless windows, where Windows as a platform allows me to easily navigate between them. But really this style of navigation doesn't work well in a browser. Now if we take a look at the same application built for a browser with Rapide. This is the Guardian web change request, and what I have here is at the top level a tab where I have my home page, which allows me to sign in and sign out and change my project. I have my change request list, and I have my release pack list. And then if I go to change requests, if I open one up, it doesn't appear as a pop-up, it appears in this frame to the right here, and then I've got within that different tabs for the areas that I'm interested in. And then if I open up a second change request, and then a third one and a fourth one, here I have 4 change requests open in this multi-document interface. So I have 4 procedure steps of change requests, each containing these tabs. So it's the same functionality from the user's perspective, but in a layout style that is much more appropriate for a browser. And for example, if I want to add a change request, that can appear in here as well. And if I want to produce a report of change requests, that can appear. And if I take a particular change request and want, for example, the change request testing report, then I can have a pop-up because I don't mind a pop-up for that particular requirement, and then that can appear in the list as well. So hopefully you can see that this style of layout is much more appropriate. It's also what we call responsive. So if I make my browser smaller, notice how the windows, the controls are moved around, so depending on the browser size, and I can even allocate more space to the change request. So that's an example of an application built with Rapide. And if I just take a look at the release packs, similar sort of thing here where I have a release pack and it needs approval, and I come in and I approve it, then notice here how I made a change to the status over here and it changed it over here. So that's the synchronization between the windows. A few other things. With Rapide, the list boxes by default, the user can change the width of columns, and that's remembered. You can also even move them around, so if I prefer my customer reference to be there, that's supported. We also support these editable grids, so instead of having to have a separate pop-up to provide the data, you can directly edit data inside a cell, and I can choose, for example, from drop-downs or enterable fields. So hopefully that's given you a flavor for the type of user interface that's possible. Now, how is that designed in the model? Well, if you go back to the web screen, we have at the top here the main page. So I have a home page, a change request tab, and a release pack tab. And that's this procedure step here. So I have the 3 tab buttons, and I have something called a frame into which I'm going to load my procedure step. So in this case, when I'm in the change request tab, I'm loading my change request list. So into this frame, I load my change request list, which is a separate procedure step. And my change request list, I can go to the change request detail, which is this one. So when I click on it, into this frame here, I load the change request detail. So into this frame, I load this procedure step, and in this procedure step, I have another tabbed interface, and into that frame, I load the individual detail procedure steps. So these are all separate procedure steps, which in the GUI would be separate windows, and I can leave them as separate windows in the GUI. I haven't necessarily even had to change them, but instead of loading them as a separate pop-up, I'm loading them inside the frame. And then I specify, using the Rapide Designer, For example, in the change request list, I specify that my frame is implemented using what's called a multi-instance tab, and that's what gives you this ability to load multiple procedure steps into the frame, what's called a multi-instance tab. And then very simply what I say is the procedure steps I want to load into this frame are the ones that I flow to using either the report output, the add change request, or the change request launch dialog flows. So I load these procedure steps into the frame when the exit state was triggered. So it's exactly the same concept that you already have in your models. I have my dialog design and my change request list, and then when I invoke, for example, this one here, when I invoke the dialog flow to the add change request using this exit state, this procedure step here, instead of being loaded as a pop-up, so the add change request, this one, instead, when I click on the add change request, it's loaded inside the frame. So that's really designed to make it very easy to take an existing Gen GUI application with multiple windows and to be able to lay them out in this style that's more appropriate for browser without having to substantially change your existing code. We're just adding a few simple areas in there like these frames, and then we can then load other procedure steps into those frames. So that's the concept really. So that's hopefully giving you an idea of the capabilities. It's really just scratching the surface in terms of what Rapide is capable of. So I would urge you to come and talk to us, look at more information on the website, send us an email with any questions and further discussions you may want to have. Well, thank you very much for attending.